What's up, nerds? It's been a while since I've done a philosophy video, and I thought I should do a philosophy video now. I never know what to say when I start these. One of these days I'll get the hang of it. Today we're talking about Frozen 2 and the potentially unnerving philosophy behind it. You think this is just a family-friendly kids movie? No, you're wrong. The central thematic core of this film is filled with weird, absurd, potentially unnerving philosophical questions. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Particularly Olaf, everyone's favorite snowman with an existential crisis.
How I wish this could last forever. And yet change mocks us with her beauty. Do you ever worry about the notion that nothing is permanent? Hey, let me ask you, how do you guys cope with the ever-increasing complexity of thought that comes with maturity? You said some things never change, but since then, everything's done nothing but change.
Throughout the film, we see Olaf undergoing, like I said, an existential crisis. He's questioning his existence, trying to cope with the absurdism that is life. And while those concepts are interesting in and of themselves, today I'm going to be focusing on where Olaf ends up in the film. But before I go into too much detail, let's give a little bit of a summary. One of the messages that is repeated over and over again in the movie is that water has memory, which is completely and utterly unscientific and not true. But for the purposes of a fantasy kids movie, we'll go with it. Water has memory, and since Olaf is made out of snow, which is just water, he carries certain memories. This comes in handy when he temporarily dies.
I'm flurrying away.
But then is ultimately and inevitably revived by Elsa at the end of the movie.
Thank goodness, water has memory.
Oh, I love happy endings.
The idea being that since Olaf has all of his memories, that he is the same Olaf, that he continues to live. But what if I were to tell you that that idea is not philosophically agreed upon? The issues and problems with the concept of personal identity has plagued philosophers for centuries. Some of you might already be familiar with the thought experiment of the ship of Theseus. And if you're not familiar with it, then that's okay, because I'm going to explain it right now. Let's say you have a ship, the ship of Theseus, and you really like that ship. You sail on that ship constantly. Due to your constant sailing, the ship inevitably will have certain damages done to it. Let's say one of the pieces of wood of the ship is damaged, and you need to replace it. And so you tear out the old damaged piece, and you put in a new undamaged piece. All great and good. Would we still consider this the same ship of Theseus? Well, sure, yeah, presumably. Okay, let's say over time, more and more pieces of wood become damaged, and we have to replace them. And eventually we get to a point where every piece of wood, every part of the ship of Theseus is damaged and needs to be replaced. If we do that, do we then have the same ship of Theseus? Is it the same ship as we began with? Well, maybe, perhaps. But to further contribute to the weirdness of the situation, let's say we take all of the old damaged pieces that we've already replaced, and let's say we just construct a new ship with those pieces, the original pieces of the original ship of Theseus. What do we say about that ship? Is that the original ship of Theseus? And if that's the case, how do we have two ships of Theseus? Theseuses. You understand the dilemma. In fact, the philosopher Irving Copey argues... Philosopher Irving Copey argues that if something changes, then it is no longer the original thing. But if it is no longer the original thing, then what changed? Nothing really changed. And so this idea, this concept of changing and personal identity is weird, okay? It is a mystery that the philosophical community doesn't really have I don't want to say they don't have good answers to, but there's no consensus on the matter. And so we have this problem with identity over time. How can we say an object at time 2 is the same object at time 1 if there have been changes that have occurred? Aristotle gets around this problem by introducing the 2 different types of changes. He argues that there is an essential change and an accidental change. These involve, of course, the accidental and essential properties of an object. An accidental property is a property that is non-integral to the object, where an essential property is something that is integral to the object. It's the essence of what the object is supposed to be. So an accidental change would be something like painting your house. It doesn't matter what color your house is, it's still a house. But an essential change would be your house burning to the ground. The wood that constituted your house is now just a pile of ashes. That's an essential change. It is no longer a house. And so if we think about this idea, in some sense, an object can change while remaining the same object. The problem is when it comes to personal identity, when it comes to human identity, what are the essential and accidental properties of a person? Those are a little more unclear. Some people say that it's our matter, right? Our physical extension is continuous over time, and so we're the same person. But there's a problem with that because we don't have the same bodies as we had when we were children. In fact, we don't even have to go that far back. Over the course of just a few years, our bodies can be completely different. We can gain or lose weight, gain or lose muscle mass. We can have plastic surgery. I can grow facial hair, and that's different. What is it? Every, like 7 years or something, all of the cells, all of your skin cells have been replaced? What is that? I'm going to look that up. Skin cell replacement rate. Does the human body really replace itself every 7 years? Red blood cells live about 4 months, while white blood cells live on average more than a year. Skin cells live about 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, so there you have it. Every 2 or 3 weeks, all of our skin cells are different. And so it doesn't seem fully correct to say that the continuity of physical extension should be the determining characteristic of personal identity, which is what... Which is why others argue that mental continuity is the determining characteristic of personal identity. And this idea is controversial in its own right for a couple reasons. One, many philosophers don't think there is a substantial difference between the mind and the body. The whole idea of physicalism is that the mind is just a bodily function. And so the problems with holding matter to be the underlying foundation of personal identity still come into play when we hold the mind to be the underlying foundation of personal identity. But assuming that the mind and body are different, or by getting around this problem by redefining our terms to be psychological continuity rather than mental continuity, we still run into some issues. But before I explain the issues, I want to explain the theory, right? That's probably a good thing to do, right? Under this theory of mental or psychological continuity, you could say, I guess, that the essential characteristics of a human are the thoughts, ideas, particularly the memories of the person. And then properties like physical attributes, of course, would be the accidental properties of a person. And that sort of makes sense. If you reflect on your life, are you the same person you were 10 years ago? In some sense, you have the same DNA, although I guess DNA can and does change over time. Our genome changes over lifetime and may explain many late onset diseases. Summary: researchers have found that epigenetic marks on DNA, chemical marks other than DNA sequence, do indeed change over a person's lifetime, and that degree of change is similar among family members. Does your DNA ever change? DNA is constantly changing through the process of mutation. So our DNA isn't even constant. So clearly we've changed accidentally. Our physical properties are much different than they were 10 years ago. But the thing is, most of us have changed our mind about certain things, right? Our thoughts that we have, our opinions on different topics have all changed. And so, in that sense, too, we have become different people. And yet, if a criminal commits a crime in the past, right, and we finally gather the evidence 10 years later, or I don't know, I guess depending on the crime, it would depend, right? There are some statute of limitations or whatever. But assuming it was a heinous crime, we would still hold that person accountable, right? We would still say, you did that. And so what would it be that determines our persistence over time as individuals? Well, it would be our memory that we have done things in the past. There's a general criterion for this rule, the memory criterion, that for person Y at time 2 to be the same person as person X at time 1, that person Y has to remember an event that person X went through. Person Y has to remember an experience person X has. That means your future self has to remember your past self, or your present self has to remember an event that your past self went through. And this idea is very much in accordance to John Locke's philosophy. And yes, it's the same John Locke that inspired the traditional American ideals of life, liberty, and property, among others. According to John Locke, identity depends on consciousness, not substance. So not physical substance, not a mental substance, but a consciousness. And what he means by consciousness is this sort of continual memory. In his work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, he writes, "This being premised to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, and that therefore consciousness always accompanies thinking, and 'tis that makes every one to be what he calls self." And so for Locke, what gives you your sense of personal identity, what constitutes yourself as yourself, is a repeated remembrance, a repeated self-identification of yourself, or in other words, your memory of yourself. And Locke subscribes to this idea so much that he argues that if Socrates were to act completely different while asleep than he did when awake, that we should treat those as two different people, because awake Socrates doesn't remember what sleeping Socrates does, right? And so again, to reiterate, for Locke, it's a persistence of memory that defines your personhood. This is very much in line with what Frozen 2 teaches, right? Olaf has all of the memories of himself, and so he is the same person, right? So Olaf at time 2 has all of the same memories as Olaf at time 1, and therefore Frozen 2 says that Olaf 2 is the same as Olaf 1. But hold up! We've been talking this whole time about continual remembrance, right? A persistence, a continuity of our psychological and mental phenomenon. Olaf died. He ceased to exist. And for a certain amount of time, he did not exist. His memories, if we were to chart on a graph his consciousness, the graph, the function, would not be continuous. And so what does this say about his personhood? Is he not the same Olaf because it's not continuous? Locke would probably argue that it is the same Olaf. Going back to that Socrates example, he's saying that awake Socrates is a different person than sleeping Socrates. But the idea in that is that there are gaps in the psychological continuity. And so for Locke, that probably isn't a problem. But for other philosophers, it seemingly would be a problem. Let's go back to our criminal example. 10 years ago, someone committed a heinous crime. Not only have they changed physically and perhaps in their opinions and viewpoints, but let's say they have forgotten the event entirely. Let's say they don't remember committing that crime. Should we not hold that person accountable because he can't remember? That doesn't seem right to me, personally. I don't know. I want to compare this to another character in a video game that I like, that I enjoy playing, in StarCraft. So in the first StarCraft game, there's a character called Phoenix. He's a Protoss character, and that's an alien guy. Anyway, the story goes, I can't remember it exactly because it's long and convoluted, and I played it a long time ago. But Phoenix eventually dies.
The call awaits me, Carradine. And although I am prepared to face my destiny, you'll not find me easy prey.
Then that shall be your epitaph.
Phoenix! No.
So, yeah, there's spoiler alert for StarCraft. But then in the second game, in StarCraft 2, you go to a place where apparently there's this thing where Phoenix's consciousness, or rather his memories, were put inside of another being, and that being was made dormant until you activated him or something. Again, the story's kind of convoluted and it's a long game, and so I don't remember it. But anyway, the idea is that there is this Phoenix 2 with all of the memories of Phoenix 1, except there was a gap in continuity, much like our Olaf case. The thing is, StarCraft 2 comes to a completely different conclusion. StarCraft 2 treats Phoenix 2 as a different character.
You were right all along, Hierarch. I am little more than a clone of your friend Phoenix. I am synthetic, a replication, a lie. I am not Phoenix, yet I hold his memories as if they were my own. I am Phoenix, but not. I am my own entity, and I take pride in this.
Going so far that eventually he changes his name.
I am honored to choose my own name. It will be Talendar.
Because he views himself as someone different than the original Phoenix. Now, there is a substantial difference in that the substance is different. In the case of Olaf, he has all of the same matter as Olaf 1. So you can make that case. There's a gap in continuity of memory, but the matter is the same, so it's the same Olaf. In StarCraft 2, Phoenix has completely different matter, and so that's what makes him a different person. Except going back to our objections for holding matter as the foundation of personal identity, matter changes, and yet we still consider ourselves in some sense the same person as we were when we had different bodies. And so even that doesn't answer the question. If we can be sympathetic for Phoenix 2 being a different person than Phoenix 1, what does that tell us about Olaf 2 compared to Olaf 1? In both of these cases, there is a gap in continuous consciousness. And so the conclusion that this is indeed the same Olaf at the end of the movie as at the beginning of the movie, that seems somewhat, at least somewhat, unfounded. Do we have an actual basis to believe that that is the same Olaf? I would argue probably not. And given that Olaf has already undergone an existential crisis in this movie, I think it would be brilliant for the writers at Disney to continue that crisis with this line of reasoning in the inevitable third movie, right? In the inevitable sequel that they're going to make. The Frozen franchise already is just too popular. There's no way they're not making a Frozen 3, right? So in that movie, in Frozen 3, Disney, listen to me. This would be an excellent character development for Olaf, to struggle with this issue of identity. Is he really the same Olaf? That would be so funny, in my opinion. It would be sort of similar to Beth in Rick and Morty, not knowing if she is a clone or if she is the real Beth.
Am I the clone? Did the real me choose to leave? And I only think I chose to stay because that's what I need to think, because I'm the replacement Beth?
Anyway, I think that would be good for Disney to do. Maybe I should write for Disney. But at any rate, what do you guys think? What is it that constitutes our personal identities? What makes us the same people as we were in the past? Or do you even think that we are the same people? Or do you think that we're completely different? Like I said, philosophy has not come to a consensus on this. So it's an interesting issue that absolutely requires more discussion. So leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Let's have that discussion. Like the video, subscribe to my channel for more philosophy content and other stuff. And with that, I will see you later, nerds.